Hi, I'm Paul. I'm a member of the Art Club in Sun City Center, Florida, and a volunteer. One of the things that I like doing for the members of the club on a volunteer basis is to cut the mats for those members who would like to have their work framed. To do that, I use a professional mat cutting machine, and in the video that follows, I'm going to show you some of the things that are important to know about that machine and invite members of the club to be trained on the machine and join me in volunteering. The machine we use is around the corner from the classroom, and so in this video you'll probably notice some extraneous conversation. There was a class going on during the times that I shot the scenes which follow. I hope you enjoy them. Use of this mat cutting machine involves maintaining it properly, and that involves not more than just the settings. We want to make sure that when we cut the hole in the mat, that the knives are quite sharp. And to that end, we have the ability to change them on a regular basis. That's done because we have, we have a lot of these razors, and you change them quite simply, loosening this holding piece and pulling it out of its holder. When you turn it over, you'll see that the very sharp part is here, and sometimes just an inspection of the knife will tell you if it needs changing. There's I don't know if you can see it very well, but you can see the wear that's going on here. And sometimes if, for example, the wear is just here but not here, you can merely change this. It's held in place with a magnet, and it slides against the stop here. You just pull it tight, reinserting it into the holder, and you want to make sure that it's exactly in the right place. And I do that by making use of this housing, placing my fingers on the front and the back and moving this back and forth until it's evenly spaced before tightening it down. The same thing is done on the other side. This is the bevel cutter, this is the straight cutter. You release the holder the same way as before, and you pull it out. If you're in doubt at all that it's sharp enough, then by all means you should get a new blade, a fresh blade, and install it. Again, it goes against the magnet, it slides against the holder, and it's up against the little shoulder that's put in here. Now this can be adjusted back and forth, but it's pretty important that you don't change those adjustments. We mostly ensure that it's exactly where it's supposed to be for the mats that we use here in the Art Club. Once again, install it. I hold it in the middle and tighten the little screw. So now the mat cutter is ready to use, and we know that the slices that we make will be good and sharp. Let's suppose that you have painted this nice little picture, which you might entitle Three Musicians, and it is 9 inches wide by 8 inches tall. And further, that you went to the Nearly New here in Sun City Center and you bought this nice little frame. And we know that the frame will hold a mat that is 14 inches by 11 inches. In addition, you found a piece of scrap mat board, and you've cut it to the size of the frame, so we know it's going to fit in there. And by putting it into the frame and laying our art inside, we know it's going to be a nice little piece. So the question is, what size hole do you want to cut? There are a lot of different methods that I've heard about doing this, but my favorite is to put the art in the top corner of the mat that you've done You can see it easier here. I'm going to put it like that. And then take your ruler. How much is here? That's 3 inches. In addition, you want it to come into the picture enough to hold it 1/4 of an inch. So it's really going to be a 1/2 inch, because 1/4 on this side, 1/4 on this side. So it's 3.5 inches that you're going to want your the hole in here. And 3.5 I put on this side at the bottom. Over here we have 5 inches left, which is going to be 5.5. Now, the border is going to be a total of 3.5, so really we want this to be 3.5 is 1.5 plus 1/4 is 1 3/4, because we want to balance 1 3/4 on this side, 1 3/4 on this side. So we take this number and divide it by 2. Here it's 2.5 for the 5, and 1/4 is 2 3/4 inches. So now let's take a look. Usually you don't have to do this step, but if you measure in 2 3/4 inches here, and 2 3/4 inches here, you draw a line, remember this, you're working on the back of the mat. Similarly, 2 3/4 here. Doing this, I remind you of the old adage to measure twice and cut once, because nothing's worse than doing a lot of work and finding out that you have cut the wrong hole. 1 3/4 here, 1 3/4 here. And this doesn't have to be exact, because when you set up your machine, it's going to have the precise measurements. All you need to do here is to make sure that you are going to finish with the hole that you intended. And here is where we find out if we've done the job correctly. If you look now at this hole that's going to be cut out, it's going to be 1/4 of an inch on this side and 1/4 of an inch on this side. So now we can confidently set up our machine for this border and this border. When I cut a mat here, one of the first things I do is pull the cutter toward me. That's why I have this big piece of cardboard in place that supports it, and it makes it a little bit easier to reach the controls here. And the first thing I do is, after getting the pieces I'm going to use, in today's situation I'm going to use a white border with a red 1/4 inch little stripe inside, is I get the machine ready to go. And the first thing I'm going to do is remove this supporting piece, which is necessary for the beveled inside cut, and I'll set that aside. The second thing I do is make sure that the cutter is absolutely square. This is a critical step, and so we have a carpenter's square for that purpose. So I'm going to set that here and ensure that this guide bar is straight and the supporting edge is also straight, so we know this is perfectly done. And the reason is because it does move a little bit, and this corner brace here can be adjusted back and forth, and if it should get loose, then obviously it'll be off a little bit, and you don't want it to be off at all if possible. So the mat cutter is set up, and I've checked to make sure it's going to do what it needs to do. Now the piece I'm going to use today is a little bit too long for what I want to happen here. So I'm going to measure up here and see that this part is 1 3/4 inches, so I want to do this one to be 1 3/4 inches as well. So it's now 3.5, and 1 3/4 inches would make it here. So basically, and you don't have to do this step if you just want to measure it, but it's there. And I know now that this edge has to be taken off. Overall, it will be 14.25 inches. We're dealing with some odd numbers simply because I'm using scrap today. So then if I just set this side margin a little bit to 14.25 inches, right there, and lock it down, I can then bring this up, set this in place, and I'm confident that when I cut this mat, it will be 14.25 inches. Here on this side is the straight cutter. This side, as you can clearly see, is the bevel cutter, and that will be to cut the hole inside where the art will appear. And to do that, you set it past this end and tip it down. It locks into place with this little pin, and draw it forward and unlock it. So now we have a piece that is 14.25 inches. Remove this and throw away our scrap. We now have a piece for the outside border and a piece for the little line that's going to be in, because this is going to be a double mat. An awful lot of the work that we do here would be a single mat, but just for complete here, I'd like to do a double mat. And the only thing that's important about the inner thing is the stripe that's going to wind up on the inside, is that the piece should be smaller than the outer piece, but large enough to cover the window that's going to be cut. So this means that I'm going to cut a 2-inch border in this piece right here. So here's our here's our outer mat for the 2-inch border. To do that, you set your guide here for 2 inches, right here. Similarly, you set these two guides for the 2 inches, this one and this one. Cutting the bevel piece always involves having a backing sheet, a piece of scrap. So we put that in place, and you cut your mat on the back side of what you're going to do. You cut the reverse. So I set that in place, push it against the guide here, make sure it's against the wall here, and lock it in place. This is our stop, and it goes up against the mat that we're cutting. Goes against here. Now, the important thing is to tip this down and make it all the way, and that little knife that's in there is going to cut through the piece. And it'll stop 2 inches, it'll start 2 inches. You turn the piece. I find it's easier to do the 2 long sides and then the 2 short sides, especially if your mat borders are unequal. For example, a 2.5 inch and a 3 inch, or whatever your measures call for. So now we cut the second one. Now it's time to do the sides.
Oh, good.
I'm presuming this is a landscape piece of art. Crank it down. Once again, it's going to start 2 inches from this side, and finish up 2 inches from the other side.
Clouds are layers. It's blended.
and we have a mat with a 2-inch border. Now since I'm doing a double mat, we're going to keep the hole that drops out. If this were a single mat, we would discard that hole, and if it's large enough, we could use it for a small print later. So we store some things. So I'm putting this back the way it is, making sure it's nice and flat. So we have our outer mat cut, and it is lying here face down. For this one, this is going to wind up a small double mat insert with a thin line, and it is large enough that we cover the hole that's cut out, both sides. You can see how that works. And we're going to glue it down with double stick tape. So we have a little machine that does that. And I'll just carefully put a little strip of tape here, 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 and a little bit in the middle just to anchor it nice and firm. This goes over, and we put it pretty much centered, and glue it down. Okay, we have our piece all put together. It's holding nicely, and all we have to do is decide how wide that inner stripe is going to be. It could go 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, even larger. And for a small piece like this, 1/4 of an inch is kind of maximum. So what we do now is we increase all of our measurements by that 1/4 of an inch. So I'm moving it from 2 to 2 1/4. Here from 2 to 2 1/4. And this one from 2 to 2 1/4. Once again, we have our backing sheet. We set this in place against the fence and against this side. Lock it down, and once again, using the original mat, we set our stop, and we cut. And here we cut. And finally, the sides. And we cut. And for the last cut, and we cut. Up comes our fence. This piece will drop out, and we have a perfectly done double mat.